I've got a saddlebag full of dreams I made around the campfires in the war when the night was quiet. To let the valley soak in the sunlight. Till Sweet Meadows is a ranch where we can live and all the kids after us. Warm, plenty to eat, nothing but peace.
You don't think it's right for an Indian to control 50,000 acres of the best grazing land in Wyoming, now do you, Ike? All this land around here is open to homesteading.
I've been thinking of filing on a piece of land myself.
You've never seen Sweet Meadows, have you?
No.
You ride through the Devil's Doorway and the wind is cold. Then you see Sweet Meadows. Somehow the sky is a deeper shade of blue and the grass is greener. It's the dream all men have when they ache for home.
Devil's Doorway is a 1950 Western film directed by Anthony Mann. The film focuses on Lance Poole, a Shoshone Indian played by white actor Robert Taylor. After the American Civil War, Lance returns home a respected war hero, wearing a Union Congressional Medal of Honor on his chest. Despite his service and a warm reception from his close white friends in town, he and his tribe are discriminated against by the townspeople. Lance cannot even buy a drink in the local bar. Soon the Shoshone's fertile land, Sweet Meadows, catches the eye of sheep farmers and a vindictive lawyer, Vern Coolin, who wishes to help the homesteaders take Lance's land, not out of greed, but purely because of Coolin's racism towards the Shoshone people.
Good day, sir.
Where are you headed?
I'm looking for grazing land for my sheep.
There's nothing that way but my land.
But Mr. Coonan said Sweet Meadows
belongs to me.
Knowing he will need legal aid to protect his home and his people, Lance enlists lawyer Ori Masters to help him. Despite her best efforts, Ori cannot stop Coolin. The United States government views Native Americans as closer to dogs than humans. Therefore, Lance cannot own the ancestral land of his people, making it prime real estate for homesteaders. As Coolin and his supporters close in, Lance and his tribe defend their land despite Ori's protests, and Lance suffers fatal injuries. While unmistakably a Western, The Devil's Doorway is a unique mesh of genre and theme. Thematically, the film has just as much in common with noir films as it does with westerns, and the film's characters, striking core aesthetic, and low-key lighting are distinctly noir, despite its rural setting in Wyoming. The film's presentation of Native Americans is also distinctive, with a sympathetic yet relatively progressive modern approach that nonetheless succumbs to historical inaccuracies and racial insincerities that are synonymous with the Western genre and broader cinematic portrayals of Native Americans. The film's adaptation of noir characteristics highlight the flaws with this approach towards race and Native American society. Despite these problems, The Devil's Doorway stands out as an engaging and unique Western film, albeit one caught between two different worldviews. The history of Native Americans immediately after the Civil War is an often overlooked aspect of Reconstruction-era history, and it is synonymous with tragedy. One of the few things the North and South could agree on was the supposed threat Native Americans presented. Federal attempts to assimilate Native Americans resulted in poorly planned migrations to ill-conceived reservations, along with astronomical death tolls. Indian wars, born out of American desires for expansionism, Western military deployment of Civil War veterans, and Native resistance prolonged the tragedy. The wars also guaranteed that media reports of Native Americans presented them as ignoble savages, barbarians who attacked both white men and their fellow natives without remorse. The ignoble savage is a classification for Native American depiction in media, utilized by historian John Coward in his book The Newspaper Indian. Alongside the ignoble savage stereotype was the noble savage, portrayed as natives who were peaceful towards all people and were children of the forest. Another component of noble savagery is the adoption by Native Americans of Western culture and morality, with the understanding that their own culture is irrelevant and outdated. The Devil's Doorway aligns with the noble savage classification, with Lance and his Shoshone tribesmen being at heart a peaceful people with a deep physical and spiritual connection to their land.
It's hard to explain how an Indian feels about the earth. It's the pumping of our blood. It's the love we've got to have. My father said the earth is our mother. I was raised in this valley. Now I'm part of it, like the mountains and the hills, the deer, the pine trees, and the wind. Deep in my heart, I know I belong. If we lose it now, we might as well all be dead.
As Coward describes, this either-or understanding of Native Americans represents oversimplified stereotypes. These stereotypes intentionally highlighted the difference between American Indians and the citizens of the United States, and they ingrained the idea of a cultural and often biological difference between whites and natives in the minds of the American public. The Devil's Doorway's incorporation of the noble savage characterization highlights the film's struggle between progressivism and stagnation in the presentation of Native American characters. The casting of the film and its protagonist, Lance Poole, highlights another curiosity with its depiction of Native Americans. It doesn't depict them in lead roles at all. White actor Robert Taylor plays Lance, and the film uses red face makeup to make him appear Shoshone. Despite the film's attempts to present a progressive racial message, the choice to cast white actors and incorporate red face ultimately harms the film's integrity. The character Lance Poole is an interesting aspect of this dichotomy. He is a Native American protagonist of a Western film, which, in of itself, is progressive, given that Native Americans have historically been represented in the genre as being sullen and villainous. The film clearly sympathizes with his plight, casts 19th century Indian reservations in an appropriately dark light, and depicts the racism and discrimination towards Native Americans from the townspeople and the federal government as negative. In the case of lawyer Vern Coolin, the film depicts racism as outright villainous. Lance begins the film with hope, believing that the time of Native persecution is truly behind him and his people. After all, he just led a squad of white Union soldiers without consequence.
Do you think the white doctor cares if I live or die?
I think so, yes. The whites outnumber us, Father. The war's over, all the wars, even yours. The country's growing up. They gave me these stripes without testing my blood. I led a squad of white men. Slept in the same blankets with them, ate out of the same pan. Held their heads when they died. Why should it be any different now?
You are home. You are again an Indian.
As part of Coward's noble Indian stereotype, Lance also believes that his tribe must assume the culture and dress of white Americans, and that the relevance of his own culture has waned.
Has my father forgotten the language of the white man?
I use it little.
To this end, Lance mostly speaks in English, and wears the typical garb of a Western protagonist. However, as the film progresses and the prejudice of the townspeople becomes clearer to Lance and the audience, the character's disillusion with racial unity and native inclusion shatters. Physically, he begins to noticeably resemble a typical Western film Native American character. His dark hair progressively grows throughout the film, so that by the final battle with Coolin, it is past his shoulders. His red face makeup becomes increasingly pronounced as well, and he slowly removes pieces of his Western outfit and replaces them with fictionalized depictions of Shoshone garb. Mentally, Lance stops looking outward towards the prospect of racial equality in the United States, and instead turns his focus inward to protect his tribe. This is expressed through his dialogue celebrating the tribe's traditions and their spiritual connection to the land, and through the physical evolution of his appearance and dress.
He's given a knife. Nothing else. No food, no water. He has to go up into the mountains above the snow line. Bring back the talons of an eagle. He has 3 days to do it in. Has to be back on the 3rd day before the sun goes down.
Isn't it rather cruel?
Depends on your point of view. Shoshones are a small tribe. Every man counts. Suppose one day that boy had to fight for his people. Wouldn't it be a good idea if they knew they could depend on him?
While Lance evolves and begins to rekindle his views on the importance and the relevance of his tribe's traditions throughout the narrative, the film itself appears steadfast and retains Lance's views from the beginning of the story, particularly regarding the irrelevance of native cultures in modern society. The physical decimation of the Shoshone tribe and culture, their removal from their land, as well as Lance's death at the end of the film, appear to signify the end of his culture's relevance and importance in the changing white world.
Where are the others?
We're all gone.
In the face of the prejudice Lance experiences, the film does not blame him for regressing back to the ways of his native culture, but it still casts that culture as irrelevant. While this notion is inherently racist towards Native Americans, the film's presentation of native cultures as beyond their time reflects the broad perspectives and the nihilism of film noir. The Devil's Doorway casts Lance as a protagonist doomed to fail, much like a noir protagonist. By the film's logic, even if the story had not concluded with the destruction of the Shoshone tribe and culture, life would have found a different way for Lance to lose. From the outset of the film, the influence of the noir genre is clear in The Devil's Doorway. As Lance rides heroically into town, a dog aggressively chases him and nips at his steed's heels, foreshadowing the prejudice he will later experience. As he greets his friends in the bar, lawyer Vern Coolin, the villain of the film, is shown in dark shadows.
Looks like you did good for yourself in the Army. That medal, all these stripes. What is that, a sergeant?
Sergeant Major.
When I was in the Army, the regular Army, we were a little particular who wore those stripes.
A later bar fight in the film again utilizes heavy shadows and low-key lighting, softening the barrier between noir and Western aesthetics. While Lance fights, Coolin laughs in the corner.
Zeke, who is that fella?
He's a lawyer. Name's Coolin. He's out here for his health. He's got lung fever. I got patients here in town.
But I'm afraid my father's dying.
You know you're disturbing the game.
As a villainous character, Coolin is another way The Devil's Doorway reflects the noir genre. Like many noir antagonists, he is a flat character with shallow motivations, a reflection of noir's tendency to depict the worst characteristics of humanity in its villains. Additionally, the legal authority Coolin holds over Lance and his people is a power dynamic typical of noir. Noir lighting continues to reappear throughout the film. A sequence where Lance rushes to town to find medical treatment for his dying father takes place entirely at night, with only the moon's soft light to dispel harsh shadows. Perhaps as a symbol of their growing cultural irrelevance, many shots that depict the Shoshone people and their homes are cast in low-key light, and as Lance begins to physically resemble his people, the film increasingly outlines him in shadow. While not foreign to Westerns, the incorporation of legal red tape beyond the influence of the protagonist is also distinctly noir and highlights Lance's lack of control. Similar to noir, the film is heavily critical of such broad legal power, and Lance criticizes his lawyer, Ori Masters, for her religious-like faith in the law.
I envy you, ma'am. You're being a lawyer.
Well,
You've got a faith, something to go by, like a religion. I've always wanted something like that. Something to tell me what's right or wrong. Because then you don't have to bother about your conscience. It's written out for you to follow. No matter what it does to people, it's the law. And changing the law is something you don't have to worry about.
Ori is one of the most interesting characters in the film, and reflects the noir genre, as well as another side to The Devil's Doorway's attempts to be progressive. She is a female lawyer out west in the 1860s, yet despite her progressive education and occupation, the score, camera work, lighting, and much of the film's sappy dialogue
oh, Lance.
are content to present Ori as a typical early Hollywood love interest. Lance and Ori's relationship is initially strictly business. However, Ori swoons over Lance and eventually falls for him. The music swells with romantic cues when she appears on screen, and in close-ups, the film incorporates a familiar noir trick, warm lighting and a Vaseline coating on the camera lens to make Ori appear glowing and angelic. Despite the film's aesthetic efforts to make Ori appear womanly and submissive on screen, she nonetheless remains an active character in The Devil's Doorway. She works diligently with Lance to defend his land through the law, then arranges a petition to change homesteader laws when the duo meet legal roadblocks. Later on, she advocates for her own belief in the law when Lance wishes to fight Coolin, and she contacts the United States Army to stop the fighting between the homesteaders and the tribe when Lance doesn't listen to her. Despite her active role in the story, The Devil's Doorway never presents Ori as a noir femme fatale, a positive narrative decision. Instead, the film allows Ori to be an active participant in the narrative without classifying that engagement as conniving or villainous, an unfortunate and often sexist caveat of active noir female characters. Additionally, Ori isn't punished by the narrative for being an active character. While not universal, it is common in noir films, such as Double Indemnity, for the active lead female character to be narratively punished, typically through murder.
Goodbye, baby.
Ori suffers no such fate. She is denied a relationship with Lance, but that particular narrative choice is ingrained more into the film's racial commentary.
Don't cry, Ori. 100 years from now, it might have worked.
Like many noir women, Ori Masters is stuck in a limbo between progressivism and popular Hollywood tropes. She stands as an excellent example of the film's internal struggle between social progressivism and stagnation. 70 years after its initial release, Devil's Doorway presents a complex depiction of race and history for modern viewers. The portrayal of Native Americans in westerns and in the broader historical cinematic landscape is paved with inaccuracies and racism, and The Devil's Doorway appears steadfast in its attempts to present Native Americans in a progressive and sympathetic light. While the film somewhat succeeds, it falls back on familiar tropes, such as depicting Native Americans as noble savages, a classification that casts Native American cultures as peaceful but ultimately irrelevant to modern society. The film's incorporation of noir's cynical thematic material and eye-catching aesthetics are directly tied to its presentation of Native American culture as a product of a society past its time. This reflects a form of racism that sizzles underneath the surface of the film and ironically holds The Devil's Doorway back. However, the film is a very interesting and unique addition to modern cinematic and historical discussions on race.